Most of the talk around town, and certainly as we've been talking about on this channel here, is about the looming discussions between Vladimir Putin and U.S. President Donald Trump about the outcome of the Russia-Ukraine war. That's what we've been talking about really for a long time. And earlier today, we had a show on that very subject here. But off the headlines, and really you can't get too far away from what's actually happening on the ground. In fact, we like to constantly go back to what the tactical update is showing you, because as Ambassador Freeman said on our show not long ago, you can't win back at the negotiating table what you can't win on the ground in the battlefield. And that is vital to understand. Anytime you're talking about entering into a negotiation on the cessation of a war, you have to look at a number of things. You have to look at the relative balance of power between the two sides. You have to look and see what that's projected to do over the given period of time, say 6 months, a year, 2 years, something like that, and say, all right, where are they today? Where are they going to go tomorrow? And then you can get to, all right, what kind of negotiations can we come to? For example, if you say, hey, from the Western side, I would like to have a negotiated settlement that freezes the line of contact at its current location, and then for the Ukraine side to have the ability to continue to have engagements with the West, to continue to have training, ammunition, military cooperation, etc. That's what I would like. So you can say that's what we would prefer to have. That's fine. That's fair enough. You have to have in your mind what the outcome you want of negotiations. But then you have to subject those desires to the ground truth reality. If the conditions on the ground won't support that, then you have to change your negotiating strategy. You have to change your objectives, what you even want to get out of it. What good would it be to say, hey, this is the outcome I want, if you don't have the capacity to reach it? I mean, that's like saying, I'm going to enter into the negotiations with a realtor on the purchase of a home, for example. The home's listing for $500,000. You have about $200,000, and that's all you could even get in a loan. So kind of a big delta there. But then you enter into negotiations with the owners and actually think that you can talk them into giving you the house at $200,000, even though they're selling it for $500,000. And there's a good market, and there's 4 or 5 other people in line to buy it. They're going to look at you like you've lost your mind. Well, I fear we're getting into a similar situation like that in the Russia-Ukraine war, as the two sides are starting to coalesce around getting ready for negotiations. A lot of things have been said by various partners or various parties of this war so far, and those who may do the negotiations, like General Keith Kellogg, the guy that Trump has set to be his envoy for the Russia-Ukraine war. You've had some comments by Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth. A number of other people have been making comments here and there. Trump himself has been no short on providing comments. But so too have the Russian side. They've been having their statements. Now, if all you do is look at what people say, then you may come to the conclusion, this is just the dance before the dance. This is just what people do so that when they get to the actual negotiations, that's when the hard work is going to be done. And certainly there's some truth to that. But listen to me. If you don't listen to what the Russians are saying and to what the Western/United States sides are saying in light of the ground, then you're going to probably have a little bit of a delta in reality. And that's where we are right now. So for the remainder of this episode here, primarily, I want to focus on what is happening on the ground and how does that inform the negotiations yet to come. Well, let's take a look, first of all, on the Eastern Front. Obviously, that's the most important part. There's the Kursk incursion, which the Ukraine did starting last August. There's the Kharkiv incursion that Russia did into Ukraine, which is still a small incursion into Ukraine. It's just kind of raids and so forth going on back and forth across the border. Nothing really going on there, with the possible exception of the east, or the far eastern portion of that incursion. But the main thing has been on the east. That's where everything's going to. Whatever is happening in the Kursk area or Kharkiv, that is all secondary to what's happening in the east. And in fact, because of what's happening up there, things are going worse for the Ukraine side in the east. And obviously, we've been talking about a number of places that have fallen of late. And so it shouldn't come as a shock that Volodymyr Zelensky has fired the commander of the Eastern forces again. and said, hey, this guy, of course, like Zelensky always does, he tries to caveat it and said that this is actually going to make us stronger, and this is going to help us focus more on succeeding on the Eastern Front. Here's how he put it.
Доручив сьогодні посилити командний склад наших військ на Донеччині. Генерал-майор Михайло Драпатий направлений для керівництва оперативно-стратегічним угрупованням військ Хортиця. Це найжорстокіші напрямки боїв. При цьому Драпатий зберігатиме повноваження командувача сухопутних військ, найбільш чисельної частини наших Збройних сил. Це допоможе поєднувати бойову роботу армії з правильною підготовкою бригад.
And so there he is, they're always putting a positive spin on it. Just, yes, it's a tough area. Well, no kidding, it's a tough area. But when you're talking about having fired the commanding general, you have to ask why. And this continues a long trend that we've seen from Zelensky. About a year and a half or so ago, he fired Zaluzhny. Said, no, he wasn't doing a good job, so we put in Syrskyi. Now there's been some talk that he might even replace Syrskyi. But now, before he does that, he's going to go to the guy who's in charge on the ground over there and say, well, we're going to fire him. They fired the Minister of Defense. They got rid of him, brought in a new guy. What's the common theme you see all this? Because Ukraine is losing. Has the introduction of a new person, a new leader, had any impact on the ground? Of course it has not. It has not made any difference whatsoever. Ukraine continues to lose because the fundamentals that are at play on the ground, that are at play at the two national levels that feed into the conflict on the ground, remain decisively and irrevocably on the Russian side. So it's not going to matter if you put a different guy in there. You might as well say we're going to wear a different uniform. We're going to try something different. We're going to wear a different color. It's not going to make any difference. They've tried bringing in better tanks, more tanks, air defense systems, artillery systems, more artillery systems, more artillery ammunition, F-16s even, long-range missiles, HIMARS, ATACMS, Storm Shadow, etc. Has any of that made any difference? At some point, people have to start saying, yeah, you keep saying that things are going tough and that you keep doing all these things to change, and yet what doesn't change at all is the progress of the war, and that the Ukraine side keeps losing more, and they keep losing more men. And that's exactly what we're seeing here. And forget about whether you change the commander or not. What about the men doing the fighting? That's where your real problem comes into. So now that here of late, there has been just the last couple of days ago, there has been another brigade, another of these new combat brigades that have failed. And that they're now, it's disintegrating as it deploys to the Pokrovsk area. That's important because that's the same area that Zelensky was talking about in his commentary. This why he fired this general and wanted to bring a new guy because of how tough the fighting is in the Pokrovsk area. And so now here, this 157th Brigade, which was another newly formed group, has disintegrated even before it got to the front line. Same thing that's afflicting so many. The last public figure we saw was somewhere around 100,000. 100,000 Ukrainian men have deserted their fight. And as we keep talking about this, this is a routine thing now. So even though they're bringing recruited people in or people that they force mobilize in, now they get them up to the front line, they're falling apart. And this is on the heels of, I believe it was the 155th Brigade that was all the hype around how it was trained in France. And, they had this great NATO training. They were equipped with all this modern stuff. And then the group was going to bring the force to bear on the front line, and they thought that was going to make a difference. Well, what happened? On the way to the front, the unit literally disintegrated, and thousands, apparently about 1,700, I think is the last number I officially saw, of the troops, and I think there was maybe less than 4,000 or 5,000 that were totally involved with this brigade, vanished. They didn't even fight. The commander, who had been handpicked to lead this unit, who had a good combat record in the first year or so of the war, was later fired. And last I heard, he was actually possibly also had been arrested. Actually, we put that up last week. So here's a guy that did have good combat experience, and now this group that should have had every advantage that at least possible for their side fell apart before it started. Now here's the 157th, also falling apart. And what you see is a continuation of another violation of just the principles of effective warfighting. We talked about this before too. But you can't say, all right, I'm going to take all these new brigades, I'm going to form them from scratch. We're going to recruit a bunch of guys and throw them in there, which is going to mean that almost none of your key leaders at all these different levels, from brigade to battalion to company to platoon to even to squad, have any experience and have the appropriate experience and training at those levels. Almost none of them do. It's just guys very often who are literally grabbed off the streets of Ukraine, put in uniform. They'll pin a certain rank on a certain guy and say, all right, you're a company commander, you're a battalion executive officer, etc. And then they just throw them into the mix and say, now fight as an effective unit. There's no way on God's earth that that's ever going to work. There's a reason why they keep falling apart and disintegrating before they get to the front lines, because they know, the men inside the unit knows that it's not going to work. They see it on the wreckage on the battlefield earlier today or before they get there. So they know what's waiting them. It's not a surprise to them. They don't fall for all of these commentary about how, oh, you know, it's tough fighting, but we're succeeding. We're doing good. We're going to keep, you know, plugging on for our side, because they know it's just suicide. I'm telling you, when you remember at the first of this war started in early 2022, there were long lines of people volunteering to sign up because Ukrainians were angry. They were mad. They couldn't believe their country had been invaded. They were patriotic, and they were willing to make sacrifices for their country in large numbers. And they did. And they fought heroically. They fought, in my view, well above their pay grade, well above what they should have done, because they were just fearless in their fighting. Well, the problem is, it doesn't matter, even if the Russians perform very poorly tactically, operationally, and strategically through the first at least 9 full months of this war, on and off in there. This just made some really abysmal decisions, and they paid for it. And the Russians suffered a lot of casualties, pretty high rate of casualties. I would argue that probably we'll find out in the history when this is all written, but I bet we'll discover that the rate of casualties for the Russians was highest during those first 9 months, because they had poor leaders, they were poorly equipped, and they were not ready for modern warfare. They have learned from their mistakes, though, and that was the point, that even though the Ukrainians inflicted a significant loss on them, that came at a high cost. So whatever number of troops Ukraine had at the time, and I think I've heard roughly 700,000, they have now been almost all destroyed. They've either been killed or wounded so badly they can't come back. And so now then the people here, Zelensky said the other day it's around 800,000. Well, those guys are basically people who have no military experience prior to coming into uniform. And folks, let me just tell you, if for those who are confused, and apparently there's a lot in the West that are confused, you can't just manufacture training and experience. You can put a guy in uniform, you can give him great kit, you can even give him great ammunition and weapon supplies, all that stuff. That you can do. What you can't do is generate and fake experience. And by that I mean a platoon leader needs to have several years of experience, or maybe 1 or 2 years. Really, you can do it from scratch, but only if you've had some training as an officer before that. You can have a company commander, but you need 3 to 5 years of experience, ideally. Maybe 1 to 2 in wartime situations. You need to have a battalion staff, a battalion commander that need 12 to 13 years of experience. And then that goes along with the command sergeant majors, first sergeants, sergeants first class, et cetera, the NCOs who run this thing. Each of them needs some number of years of experience and education and training. You can't just manufacture that. You can't say, all right, I'm going to put a guy at a sergeant first class and a company commander that have 3 months of experience. It's not going to work. That's just not how war fighting works. And this is not hard to figure out. This is not rocket science. This is not something shouldn't be well known, but it does seem to inflict a great many in Ukraine and in the West equally. The only ones that don't seem to be fooled by this are the Russian side, which with their own painful lessons seem to have learned it. And so they changed up dramatically how they bring people on to the force, how they train them, how long they train them, who they staff these organizations with, and then how they employ them in combat. They're making the best of a bad situation right now. And combat is a messy, bloody affair, riddled with mistakes and errors in the best of times. And Russia certainly has their share of that. But as a force, they are continually getting better, not just bigger, but also better, more effective. And it's showing on the battlefield here. And so we also have this situation where Russia is now recognizing where the weak point is in the Ukrainian defense, and they're going after the Pokrovsk area. Evidence shows that right now Russia is intensifying their attacks near Pokrovsk. And in fact, let me just jump on my screen here and show you some of the key things that have been happening on the ground. So again, these are not just anyone's opinion here. This is facts on the ground that shows that the Russian side is continuing to move forward. And in some of the areas we've been showing you before, this is the Chasiv Yar. It's all but fallen to the Russian side here. The Ukraine side still has a little bit on the outskirts of the town here, but all the rest of the areas is contested. You see Russia continues to methodically mow through. And again, Ukraine is having this really bad tactic of saying we will hold on to every single house, every street, every village that we can, and we're going to force Russia to kill us all when we move out of there. And Russia is complying. It's exactly what they're doing, and they methodically move forward. When was the last time you saw any kind of a retake of the Ukraine side? I mean, and I think I'm going to show it here in the next one. That's Chasiv Yar down in Toretsk. That was all but taken before, and then Ukraine had a bit of a counterattack here where they have moved back into the northern portion here. But folks, that's going to be a very temporary condition because Ukraine doesn't have the capacity to retake the city. So you'll see what that happens probably within the next 2 or 3 days, maybe even tomorrow. This will probably go back to the red color here. And then this very last little section here on the outside of Toretsk is also likely to fall. They just don't have the capacity to hold it. And those manpower issues are the reason why. And then let me run down here to the Pokrovsk area because that's where a lot's going on now. Russia has been continuing to strengthen its flanks on this side here. And then they have now begun to attack lots of targets inside the city of Pokrovsk. What they've been doing is going after ammunition depots, command and control centers. They've been attacking individual vehicles that they have been able to see. All kinds of attacks here in the southern part, which implies that Russia is getting ready to probably start the direct assault into Pokrovsk. And we've had Zelensky himself talk about how important the Pokrovsk area is. And if that falls, if they break through there, it's going to be a huge issue for the Ukraine side. And now then, though, let's talk about some of the problems that the Ukraine side is having, and that is just acknowledging reality. So I'm showing you what's going on the ground with all this stuff, that the Russians are moving forward and that they're taking all this ground. It's just black and white. You see it on the map. It's just methodical moving forward there. But you see, Zelensky wants to keep talking like it's really not that bad, and we're making actions and we're strengthening our defense on the front lines. But yet, I'm showing you that its manpower is continuing to fall apart. Well, let me give you another snapshot of just how detached from reality, or maybe a better word is unwillingness to acknowledge reality. So yesterday, on the 26th, military summary talked about the fact that the Toretsk, the Toretsk, I think, had been, no, not Toretsk, sorry, it's further south than that, Velikonovoselka, that finally, after a lot of fighting, on the 25th, I think the Russians had cut the city in half, and they had surrounded an area in the south of about 300 or 400 Ukrainian troops, and were putting pressure on the rest. And yesterday, military summary, along with most other mappers, came to this conclusion.
The most important updates for the previous 24 hours is coming from the South Donetsk direction. According to information we have, according to the Minister of Defense of Russian Federation, on January 26 of 2025, as a result of active offensive actions by units of the 5th Guards Separate Tank Brigade of the 36th Army and the 14th Guards Marine Brigade of the Vostok Group of Forces, the settlement of Velika Novoselovka of the Donetsk People's Republic was taken by the Russians.
So that was yesterday on the 26th. Also on the 26th, the Ukraine media was reporting this. They said, yeah, actually, there's no threat of Ukrainian forces encirclement in Velika Novoselka. So they said, no, that's just not happened. So the media, the Ukrainian media, is backing up what Zelensky is saying. But folks, it doesn't matter if you say that on the ground or in the news media if it's not true on the ground. No one's going to be fooled by this. It's not that suddenly the next day that people go over there and they'll see that, well, Russia doesn't have it, because they're on the ground. They really have. Now, today, the Ukraine media is saying this. They're showing that, okay, well, actually, I guess we did lose it. Yeah, Gary's going to put that one up on the screen there. So let's say the battlefield of Novoselica is why holding the village is important for the Ukraine army. So that's the same outfit there, RBC Ukraine. So it was interesting that today, instead of acknowledging that what they said yesterday wasn't true and that they have there's no threat of encirclement, instead they're just trying to tell you why it's important. And you go down through there, and a lot of the reasons that they give are legit, that it's going to cause a lot of problem for Ukraine going down into the further into the defensive areas, and it's going to put Peroros at danger because of the flank. This is on the flank and further a bit south than the Peroros area, so it's going to make the Ukraine side a lot more difficult on there. Now, one of the other Ukrainian media outfits at least admitted that, yeah, okay, Velika Novoselica has fallen, so they've admitted that. I think the Ukrainska outfit has reported that. But you see the RBC is still not wanting to, because they're loath to do it. And you can certainly understand why they would not want it to be true. But folks, whether you want it to be true or not doesn't change what's true on the battlefield, doesn't change who possesses military control of an important city. And so the fact that they're pointing out how important it is that the Velika Novoselica, and now that it's in Russian hands, that shows you how tenuous and how weak the situation is for Ukraine. So I just told you about the 155th and the 157th brigades that basically fell apart before even getting to the front. Well, General Sersky a couple of days ago explained that, it's not just a brigade. They have a bigger problem in that the manpower issue are not sufficient on their own to meet the needs of the armed forces. We have need at the front. We must increase the number of personnel in our mechanized brigades. Unfortunately, mobilization does not cover the demand at the front line. And that's from a week or so ago. Obviously, it's only getting worse. So again, everywhere you look, the Russian side continues to advance. The Russian army continues to grow in size, capability, and sustainment capacity. So it'll be able to sustain things indefinitely for a long time. I mean, I don't see anything that would even indicate whatever difficulties their economy is having, it's relatively small. And it also underlines or doesn't take into account that the Russian side, this is an existential fight. They have been able to keep their economy going. Things have continued to look well within the country. They have contained and limited the amount of long-range strikes that the Ukraine side has been doing. They all hurt, but in terms of the sustaining a war effort, it's a scratch. It's an annoyance. It's a mosquito bite. That's all it's having on the Russian side. And they are absolutely committed that they will fight. People in the West seem to have this fantasy that if they can make things difficult enough for Russia, if they can increase the price enough and make it cost more for Russia to go in, that Putin will go, all right, dang it. All right, I didn't want to do it, but all right, I didn't know it was going to cost. So sure, we'll just shut it down where we're at. We'll just make the current line of contact the division line, and we'll get into other kind of negotiated settlement. That is self-blinding. The Russians, it is an existential threat. They have spent probably somewhere close to 100,000 dead Russians, probably 250,000, maybe more, of wounded at various degrees. They have spent all kinds of money, rubles, and whatever they've been doing. They've retooled their economy, etc. They are not going to just say, all right, we give it our best shot. We'll just shut it down here, and then we'll just have to deal with the outcome, which is going to be a Ukraine side with Zelensky still in command and with ties to the West/NATO. Why would anyone in the West think that Russia would ever do that, much less when they're on the ascendancy? I mean, listen, folks, they're just not going to. So whatever kind of negotiated settlement anybody in the but now the Trump administration thinks that they're going to get, they need to make sure that they're aware of what's true on the battlefield, of what's true in the economy and in the war industrial capacity for the Russian side. And that means the whole Russian side, which means Iran, it means North Korea, it means dual use help even from the Chinese, and it definitely means political and economic help from a number of those, as opposed to Western Europe, which is weak, that they have a worse economy than the Russians do. And everything combined has, because the Western economies have not gone mobilization. They have not gone into wartime production. Ergo, they're never going to be able to keep up with the ammunition, the weapons, armor, etc., that the Ukraine side would need if it wanted to sustain combat over a long period of time to try and outlast the Russians. It's a fool's errand. You see, it's irrational, it's illogical, and I argue immoral to ignore all of those fundamentals realities and to try and pursue something that's unattainable. Folks, if you got $200,000, you're not going to get a $500,000 home. It's laughable to even say that out loud, but you can actually say it's a worse dynamic for what's going on here because it's even less likely to happen. And yet, that is illuminating a significant portion of Western so-called elite thinking. And if these people don't change their mind, if the Trump administration and officials don't sober up and at least have a genuine understanding of what's happening, then whenever these talks happen, whether that's Putin to Trump directly or whether it's the Secretary of State or the General Kellogg to Lavrov or any of these folks, if we think that those negotiations are going to go good with this mentality, we are going to be seriously disappointed, because I promise you the chances that Lavrov or Putin are going to soften their stance and give something that the West wants and that's not backed up by the realities I've just shown you on the ground, then there's going to be some shock on the Western side, because that's going to leave the Russians with nearly the only possibility they can, which is just to say, all right, we did the best we could. We tried to talk to you with the Minsk agreements. We tried to talk to you in December 2021 and offer you a way out that would have avoided war. We tried to have a negotiated settlement with you in Istanbul in February or April 2022. We tried again in late 2022. We tried again last summer. And we're trying again right now. We have tried everything to negotiate, but now then we see that you just won't acknowledge reality. So we're simply going to win on the ground what we need for our security, which means probably at the minimum driving to the Dnieper River, which means the loss of Odessa, which means the loss of Kharkiv City, and will put at risk even Kiev eventually. Now, I know many in the West think that's just Russian propaganda. No, folks, it's not. It's cold-blooded military analysis and an assessment of the combat realities, military realities on the ground, economic and industrial capacity on either side only. It's a cold calculation. It doesn't look at who's right, who's wrong, who's moral, who's immoral. It doesn't make any difference. Those are the fundamentals that go into deciding how wars are resolved. If we're not willing to take even the possibility of getting a negotiated settlement on only a little bit of a bad case, then the only thing left for Russia is to continue going on. And if anybody in the West wants to put that to the test and say, we don't believe that's going to happen, we don't believe Russia really can, and I know there's many people who don't. Many people look and see, how far has Russia come in 3 years of war? And then they say, how much further is the Dnieper River? And they just say, okay, it's just a linear line. As far as Russia's gone here, it's taken 3 years, then it would take another 3 years to get here. And, well, we can keep helping Ukraine, and the cost will be too high to Russia. They can't sustain it. That's not a good bet. That implies that it will be a linear move, and I argue that it won't. The more likely case is that at some point, possibly soon, the Ukraine army will finally just collapse in some portion, and Russia will roll a bunch of troops into the hole and just drive into large portions of Ukraine. And then once that happens, once there's a breakthrough, it's just human nature that you're probably going to get wholesale fleeing of the battlefield. It'll probably just be able to roll it up from one side to the next. That's the most likely case. I can't see the future. I don't have a crystal ball. All I can tell you is with some degree of confidence what the military realities are. We'll have to see whether the Trump administration team buys that or not, or whether they want to roll the dice and take a gamble that Russia would expend itself and it won't be able to take it, and that eventually they'll be forced to have a negotiated settlement on terms generous to Kiev. That seems to be the gamble some are willing to take. We'll watch and see how it plays out. Last thing I did want to talk about here, because it's news, especially in the United States, that is the newly minted now Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth was talking about some new executive orders that have been issued by the president and what the Department of Defense is going to do. Here's what he said earlier today.
If you see what the president said last week in his executive orders, he's hitting the ground running. He's made it very clear. There's an emergency at the southern border. That the protection of the sovereign territory of the United States is the job of the Defense Department, and the cartels are foreign terrorist organizations. As a result, this Pentagon Snap 2 last week, we helped move forward troops, put in more barriers, and also to ensure mass deportations, support of mass deportations in support of the president's objective. That is something the Defense Department absolutely will continue to do. And today, there are more executive orders coming that we fully support on removing DEI inside the Pentagon, reinstating troops who were pushed out because of COVID mandates, Iron Dome for America. This is happening quickly. And as the Secretary of Defense, it's an honor to salute smartly, as I did as a junior officer and now as the Secretary of Defense, to ensure these orders are complied with rapidly and quickly. Whatever is needed at the border will be provided, whether that is through state active duty, Title 32 or Title 10, because we are reorienting. This is a shift. This is not the way business has been done in the past. This is the Defense Department will support the defense of the territorial integrity of the United States of America at the southern border, to include reservists, National Guard, and active duty in compliance with the Constitution, the laws of our land, and the directives of the Commander-in-Chief.
So a couple of interesting things there that he's right there. This is definitely not business as usual. This is something that even in the first Trump administration term, they didn't do before. They did a little bit with some troops on the border, but that was primarily National Guard. This is the first time that I'm aware of that they're actually using active duty troops. So far, the numbers are pretty small. I think 1,500 is the number that I've heard, but you heard the secretary there. He's also talking about Title 32. That's just basically a different way to say we're going to bring other people on active duty and pay them from a certain fund, whatever. But the bottom line is they're going to probably have more than 1,500. But you also got to keep things into perspective. The southern border of the United States is quite large. I think it's over 1,000 miles. I can't remember the exact numbers. It's huge. And I can just tell you that 1,500 troops is not huge. So they're going to be targeted in what they can do. And I think that probably this is just a way to say, all right, well, we're not just going to sit around and do a lot of studies and, an analysis and figure this out while we take no action here. I think that this is probably, all right, let's find out where the hottest spots are, where the troops can do the most good to secure the border. We'll do them there now. And then while those are getting down there and that can produce some sort of tactical benefit and, closing some of the holes in the border, we'll be figuring out the policies back later. So I would expect to see more to come from that later. We'll see whether those numbers grow, whether they adjust, whether it'll be National Guard troops that end up doing that, or Title 32. Maybe they'll mobilize more people to active duty. I was actually in a period of my career in the early 2000s, actually shortly after 9/11, I was a reserve officer at the moment, was mobilized to active duty, and I believe it was under Title 32, brought on to active duty for a specific time, working the Pentagon for 3 years before I was totally reinforced back into active duty, and then continued on through the rest of my career. So they may do something similar to that too with reserve troops. Talks about an Iron Dome for America. So that's an aspiration. That's something that is necessary. I think if anything, this Russia-Ukraine war and the war between Israel and Hamas or Hezbollah and in Iran, where they've engaged with the Houthis, that air defense is crucial. So I'm a big supporter of that, because the war has shown that if you don't have a good air defense, then your ground troops are going to have a whale of a problem in any kind of close quarters combat. So I'm all for that, but everybody needs to understand that's going to be slow. It's going to be very expensive, but it is something that needs to be done. So I'm glad to see that they're focused on something that we actually need. One of the other things she said is that it continues to talk about defenders on the southern border. That's going to be a longer term issue here for many of the reasons I just mentioned there, because they don't know for sure what they want to accomplish. And they have to do what's called a troops task analysis to say, all right, what can our troops do? How many troops do we have? And do we maybe need to end some operations? If I could just give my 2 cents worth, you could get at least 2,000 troops by getting them out of Syria. So don't let them sit there and patrol other borders in other countries that do nothing for our national security. If you have those needs on our own border, you should probably bring them back from somewhere else, because it is a zero-sum thing. And we need to all understand that it's not just this open pie and we can just start scattering some troops here and there. Or if you do a troop task and you think, well, actually, we need about 25,000 troops that's going to be able to accomplish whatever the objective, the political objectives is that the president will set. You have to have a troop to task. You know, how many people it costs to actually accomplish what we want on the southern border. I doubt 1,500 is going to be the ceiling on that. I think it's probably going to be the floor. So we'll see how that's going to work. And I'm sure that they'll do some, you know, reserve, National Guard, and all these other kind of things here too. But even that has its limitations. You can't just bring people on to the National Guard basically and put them permanently on the border, because that's going to cause problems in the state. And it's going to be a diminution of their capacity there. It's going to be a big weight on the civilians who are willing to serve. So there's no easy answers here. And everybody needs to understand that going in, that this is going to be a long process. And then we'll end up seeing how they end up applying it. And then, of course, we'll see what is the reaction. What is the results of this? Is the border made more secure? Have we secured our air and ground control points on the border, et cetera? So we'll continue to watch that here. But that's the current situation in the Defense Department. Apparently, there's going to be some additional executive orders regarding national security that are going to be signed by the president later tonight. If anything breaks on that, we'll let you know what that is tomorrow. But in the meantime, I appreciate you guys being with us today. And by the way, I do want to invite you to tune in tomorrow. We're going to have at noon tomorrow, we're going to have Colonel Jacques Beau, who one of our most popular analysts that we have on the show here, because he is going to provide some information about something that's happening on the Ukraine side of the line of contact in that war there that almost hasn't gotten. In fact, I've not seen anything on it in the Western press anywhere. So he's going to show you that there is another vulnerability for the Ukraine side besides what's actually happened at the line of contact that could well be very influential, if not outright decisive, on how negotiations go. So you're not going to want to miss that at noon tomorrow. Jacques Beau, turn in here. We'll see you then on the Daniel Davis Deep Dive.